Welcome to the Parenting in the Bubble conversation. You may notice I'm not here by myself. I have the opportunity to be able to share this time and share the conversation with my incredible wife, Melissa. And we're excited to be able to begin to just have this conversation about the challenges, let's be honest, that exist for pastors' kids because of the bubble that oftentimes is created around them and just the ministry experience as a whole. We want to share also from just personal experience on two sides. We kind of both have a unique story in the fact that both of us are pastors' kids. We both kind of grew up in different parts of the country and different church experiences. And yet at the same time, we are also raising a family of three kids as well. So here's a quick introduction to our family. I'll let you, Melissa, why don't you take a moment and just share a little bit about our family and how we have, a little bit of our journey as well.
So you'll see our son Aaron, the oldest, is 15 there, and our daughter Noelle is 11. And then our Joshua is 6 years old. And you may notice he doesn't look exactly like us, and that's because he was made in China and came to us a little later in life. But we've been he's been with us for 3.5 years.
Yeah,
Three and a half
a
years
little over
now.
3 years.
So yeah, and it's been a good season for all of us.
Let's take a moment. Why don't you share a little bit about just your personal experience growing up? Where did you grow up? What kind of church situations did you experience, Melissa? As you grew up as the oldest of three kids as well. But talk a little bit about your family, your ministry experience, kind of growing up.
My dad was actually bivocational for the first 11 years of my life. We lived in a very rural farming community, so he was a farmer and pastor of the local small church. And when I was 11, he wanted to go back to school and seminary, and so we moved to Phoenix area, Arizona, and he continued in his education in seminary, but also became a church planter in that area. And so I continued on my pastor's kid journey in a larger city type of environment. And my dad stayed there several decades, actually retired out of that church where I grew up.
Which
So,
is an incredible thing too, to just experience the longevity. I mean, you talk
yeah.
about two different dynamic ministry settings, one being extremely rural, having to be bivocational, just in order to make a living, and the challenges that sometimes that creates for family and for kids, and then moving to a major metropolitan city from being in the Phoenix metro area, and let alone being a church planter. Mine's a little bit different. I grew up more on the east side, and I saw my dad serve in several different churches at a young age, and last being in a small community in rural central Kentucky. And you may go, oh, Kentucky. Yes, all the jokes about Kentucky are true, but at the same time, it's a beautiful place to live and to grow up. But the ministry experience wasn't quite as positive, I would say, for our family, at least through some of those years. They were challenging. And I literally saw my dad when I was about the age of 11 burn out of ministry, pastoral vocational ministry. And that was a difficult situation to sit and watch your hero wrestle with kind of mental challenges and the stress and anxiety that were created from living in the bubble and doing ministry. And so some of the conversation we're going to share, I'm going to share a little bit more of that story and some of the things of how that impacted me growing up and some of the lessons I've learned when it comes to even raising our own kids in the bubble and ministry as well. The reality is our world is changing at a rapid pace, and there are all kinds of pressures right now that exist for kids, whether or not they're in ministry, if they're ministry kids or they're just kids. And here's some interesting kind of tidbits that I think would be helpful for us to begin to understand. I'm going to just slide us a little bit over here so it's easier to read. But here's some things that we're finding out to be true in our world today. Sociologists say raising kids today is harder than ever due to our globalized, stressed, information saturated kind of society. And we're kind of child indulgent. And yet, all these things are at our disposal And yet children are lonely and in some ways even neglected by society. And just because you're in a church doesn't mean that those things go away. So I think that's helpful to understand. Our kids have more than any previous generation as well, right? I mean, my
We
kids
remind our kids of that all the time.
all the time, and it's hard for them to believe that TV used to be something that didn't have a remote control and you had to walk up and turn it on. They don't understand what life was like before the internet and so many other aspects of that. But the reality is they have more information at their disposal than any other generation of children growing up in human history. Um, Another thing that we find is they're even better educated. Children tend to be more humanitarian focused than our previous generations were. And yet, they are also searching for significance beyond materialism. They want to make sure that their life matters in some shape or form. Childhood is also about, I think we need to understand, about making mistakes, maturing through experiences in order to gain wisdom and build character. Melissa, why don't you share a little bit, just what are some of the things that we've tried to balance when it comes to our kids understanding it's okay to make a mistake? And, what have we learned even from our previous experiences growing up in our homes that I think would be beneficial to our listeners?
I think naturally there's an expectation from our kids, maybe from other people or maybe from themselves, like, well, you're a pastor's kid, you need to be not perfect, but close to that. And so I think that's naturally there, so you have to really almost overly be aware of making sure they don't have the pressure of perfectionism on them. And I think that's that's just kind of a day-to-day walk and figuring that out. I know recently with our oldest, he was at church camp with some friends, and there was an activity that probably wasn't the best decision for him, and going out late and stuff like that, but kind of in those moments, like, okay, maybe not the wisest, you need
He's
to.
still a teenage boy.
Yes, but also knowing, like, he's still a kid. He still likes to be with his friends and still does goofy teenage boy things, and walking that balance of making sure they understand, yeah, you have to be held accountable, yeah, you have to behave, but also knowing, like, we all screw up, we all sin. That's why we have Jesus and the church to help us in those times. So I think being pretty verbal about some of that and owning your own mistakes as a parent is pretty important in that process too.
Absolutely, and I think to even add to that, we need to be careful as parents that are ministers, so as pastors, of putting too many expectations on our children out of fear of how it reflects upon us.
Absolutely.
And when that becomes dominant in our perspective of how we go about parenting inside the bubble of ministry, it can become very detrimental to our children as well, because not only are they carrying the expectations that they already carry because of being your child, now that it seems to be multiplied exponentially when they feel like their parents are specifically disappointed. At the same time, they will smell a level of the hypocrisy of, are you more concerned about your reputation and what this reflects on you, or you actually care about me as a child? And children, they're smart. They may not be able to articulate it, but they can pick up on that. The second point is our kids desperately need our loving connection to offset outside pressures. In other words, we have to be deliberate to make sure that we create time, and we'll talk a little bit more detail about this, but create time just to be a family and to have fun and to laugh and to create routine and traditions that our kids actually look forward to. I think of one of the things I think, Melissa, you've done extremely well at is how you engage our children through Christmas and the Christmas season and make it fun for them, and yet at the same time they're continuing to be challenged and learn in their faith journey as well. Why don't you just share a little bit about what you do routinely when it comes to the Christmas season?
Well, it started traditionally in our family, but we call it Advent, and so on December 1st, There's a couple systems I have of reading part of the Christmas story, kind of a, a little sort of Velcro sticky chart with different characters in the nativity scene. But then there's another calendar with a note for every day, and every day it's something sort of special that we do, whether it be we're going to make Christmas cookies tonight and pass out to neighbors, we're going to go get ice cream tonight together as a family, we're going to play this game together. Or I've also done today is so and so's day, one of the siblings, today is Joshua's day, you have to do something nice for him. And so they really look forward to that every December. And it's
even as they've aged,
yes, I was just going to say,
that they
as
still.
Our 15-year-old acts like sometimes he's not into it, but he is.
Yes, he'd be disappointed
Yeah.
When it's not his day.
Yeah.
So.
But trying to, acknowledge two things. One, the real reason we celebrate Christmas obviously is an important message we want to continue to communicate and talk about. But we also know Christmas is fun, and there's just special things to it, even with food and activities that it's okay to celebrate that part of Christmas too.
And then I love that. And I my encouragement to you as parents that are watching this is figure out ways to engage your kids, to have fun, use it as a way to continue to help them develop in an organic way in their own personal relationship with Jesus. And the more that you can do that, it's going to really help create a solid foundation for them to navigate not only the pressures of ministry, but life outside of the churches as well. The third thing I think it's important for us as parents to remind ourselves is simply the truth that kids really are used by God to sanctify us. I can tell you, first and foremost, I think every parent can agree, we didn't realize how selfish we really were until we brought kids into the world. And it becomes a stark reality and a mirror to all the challenges and things that God is working to mold in us to move us away from being flesh-driven into being spirit-led people.
I always tell people and my kids, I was a much better Christian before I became a parent. Now I'm more sinful.
Exactly. Some dangers that I want to just point out to, and I think this is an important conversation as a part of this, is the more that we can recognize some of the dangers and the challenges that exist, then the more cognizant we actually are in how we engage and how we maneuver and how we walk with our children through the different moments that they're going to feel the pressures of being in ministry. First of all, family neglect because I'm doing God's work. Don't fall into that trap. In other words, it is very easy. And I've literally had pastors tell me, well, I'm just trusting God to raise my kids because I'm doing his bidding. I'm doing his calling. I think that's wrong. And, a couple of spots in scripture that even point that perspective as being a wrong perspective is Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4 and 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. And we've got to be diligent when it comes to how we engage our children on a day-to-day basis, helping them develop their own faith journey as well, and understanding who Christ is and what Christ has done for them. And so, Pastor, be very careful of allowing other people's emergencies to become your emergencies for the detriment of your own family. There's sometimes, I get it, like you may need to go respond, but that's where think of it from a piggy bank standpoint. You're taking money out. You got to make sure that you're redepositing. And so your kids are the same way. If you take something out, make sure that you're taking time to adequately deposit back in them. Anything you want to say about that, Melissa?
I think, practically there have been times for you where you get a call or something comes up and it just has to be attended to. And generally, we try to communicate about that together. Is this really something that is that important? How do we both see it? But there have been definitely times where you've gotten a phone call and say, look, I'm at my daughter's softball game. I can't do that right now. I can help you tomorrow or whatever. And I think that's very appropriate. And you really have to, I think, communicate with your spouse on that. Wives have to hold that a little loose. I've seen some wives get angry about every little interruption, and that's not realistic. But also, your wife may have a sense of like, I don't know that that's needs to be your priority right now in this moment. And hopefully as spouses you can communicate through those moments and lean into the Holy Spirit and what maybe he's prompting you to do or not do.
And people will tend to, when they get into crisis, they won't recognize the habits that they've been living out over the last decade, sometimes 2 decades. And they want you to create an instant fix to the problems that honestly they've been seeding for years. That isn't going to happen. There is no magic pill to all of a sudden make and wipe out all those issues and take care of all those emergencies. And so just because they've been seeding bad habits in their life or in their marriage or into their family for decades doesn't mean that you have to drop everything in that moment and just commit to walking with them and hearing them out. It's easy to set up a time, and I just tell people I'm typically 2 weeks out. So if you want to spend time with me, we'll get it on the calendar, but you just need to know I'm about 2 weeks out. Let's be honest, that's better than the medical doctor typically operates as well. The second thing is, don't watch the double standard. In other words, fight against. Don't allow hypocrisy of the faith to actually ever exist in your home. I think our kids are incredibly resilient, and they will forgive us for all kinds of things in our life, especially when we come and we openly admit, I was wrong, my perspective, my tone, whatever was off. But it's really, really difficult for them to get around the idea of hypocrisy of the faith when it comes to home. In other words, when they see one of their parents act or say or talk a certain way in church and then come home and operate and act in a completely different manner, they can't make sense of that. And it's easy then to dismiss, well, faith is just something that we put on the outward appearance. It isn't something that honestly penetrates our heart. And that can become incredibly detrimental to pastors' kids. And so really, really be careful of allowing that to happen. Melissa, what are some of the things that you saw even your parents do? Because I think they've done a great job of being consistent, both in the home and in public. And so what are a few things that come to your mind of how they didn't allow the hypocrisy of the faith to actually exist in the home?
I think my parents were good about being real about the struggles of life and ministry, but also making the best of it too. I know there were times my dad would openly admit that there was a couple messes he was dealing with at the church, and he was going to have to go to a couple meetings for the next few nights. And he would make a joke about having to get his butt kicking boots on and go out to a meeting, and just kind of in that way kind of acknowledging, like, sometimes it's messy and sometimes it's difficult, but this is what we do, and we aren't afraid of these messes stepping in. And my parents also were very good about just admitting their shortcomings or their flaws, and being humble about times that they maybe didn't handle something right as well, and just kind of being real, but always striving towards being better too.
Yeah, I love that. And I think even in my own family, like I give them incredible credit because we walk through some very difficult things. Watching them be poorly treated by even other leaders within the church, challenging them because they were actually leading people to Christ, and having leaders, elders of your church actually come to you and say, stop doing that because we don't want those people in our church. That really happened to my parents. And so watching them love people even in the midst of the challenge, and there was an open communication when things were hard. They didn't necessarily divulge all of the juicy details, but they were open to admit, yes, this is hard, we're struggling, we're going to trust the Lord in this. And to be able to watch that as a child actually get lived out, not just something that was talked about, allowed me, even in those most challenging times of watching my parents walk away from vocational ministry, I had a healthy understanding of the political posturing that can take place in the local church, but I never found myself in a place rebelling specifically against God or the church. they did it in such a fashion that my passion and my heart still stayed tender to what God was doing and how he was working in and through the church. And I think that's ultimately what our hope and our desire is. And I can tell you first and foremost, that's not easy. Both Melissa and I have walked through very, very painful moments in pastoral ministry in multiple different positions. And it's hard to know how do we navigate our kids through the changes and the challenges that they may see us walking through.
It's definitely important for them to, and us to communicate, but for them to see that people are still sinners. The church is still full of sinners. That is not what God is. That is not what Jesus is. They're very different. God and the church are not simultaneous. Opposed, yes. There's shortcomings, and we are always going to be disappointed in people, but God is not going to disappoint us.
Absolutely. The third danger is sometimes we can fall into the trap of what I call Eli's trap. Eli being a man of God, and yet his own sons were anything but godly people. And I think that the Eli's trap that we've got to be careful of falling into ourselves is just assuming that just because our kids are around the church and that they by default hear about God, we can fall in a trap thinking, well, that's going to be enough. And that in itself is going to capture their attention, capture the heart, and then they're going to walk with Jesus. Just because they're around the church and just because they hear about God from Sunday school teachers or from the Sunday sermon or a small group leader doesn't mean that they're going to turn out right. We've got to spend time on our knees praying over our children. We need to engage them in spiritual conversations. And no matter what, whether or not it's out on an evening walk, whether or not it's dealing with school challenges, relationship challenges, point them in every chance you possibly can, point them towards the cross, point them to Jesus, and help them understand who he is and what he came to actually accomplish in our lives.
The reality is there's no magic formula to having your kids walk with God. I'm reminded that Israel had the perfect father in God, and yet they still rebelled. And our kids very likely could rebel or have moments of rebellion or a lifestyle of rebellion, and that's not necessarily anything that we can perfectly control or fix. It's something that's really we have tools, we have ways to help them, but ultimately we have to trust that God's working in their hearts and that he's doing those things.
Fantastic. And then number 4, and we kind of alluded to this already a little bit, but manage your and others' expectations wisely. Expecting perfection, that's just not reality. And I know for me, and I've watched other pastors' kids get damaged by this, where a youth leader may actually come up to a kid and say, hey, you should know better, you're the pastor's kid. That's detrimental. And what I try to even talk to the side of my staff members and the people that I know are pouring into my children's life is don't treat them different than any other kid in this ministry just because they're my kid. Love them as you would love anybody. Walk with them. They are going to make mistakes. I promise you. They have my DNA in them. Like, they're not perfect. And so treat them as such. The other thing I would encourage you to do is find a person, either, an adult male, if you have a son, adult female, if you have a daughter, that are wise and are godly people, and ask them to just spend a little bit extra attention towards that child. Ask them to pray for them, and as they get older, maybe take them out for a burger or something. It's helpful to have other people besides their parents pouring into them spiritually and helping develop that in their lives. Here's some practical tips that I want to talk about, and let me see if I can move us up here so that we're not out of the way. But some practical tips. Allow your kids to enjoy the perks of ministry while at the same time being honest about the challenges that are faced. There's enough challenge, and your kids are going to experience the challenges, but let's be honest. There are some perks to ministry as well that are an enormous blessing. I mean, what are some of the things that we've experienced over the years that our kids have been able to participate in as a result?
Honestly, there's a lot. Really, I feel like our family's been blessed by a lot of people in the church. Practically, something that just jumps to mind is my kids get a discount going to camp when we pay for summer camp or when they help contribute to summer camp. Our kids have gotten a discount. That's a big perk. It's a perk for us, and we remind them it's a perk for them. They get to maybe not have to strive as hard to earn money to get to summer camp, and it's a privilege.
Absolutely. And I think of other people that have, like, they've loaned us their camper,
Yeah.
or they've loaned
Yeah.
us,
boat.
a boat or a place to be able to go and stay for a couple nights. There's been opportunities where I've gone out and had to speak or teach on location somewhere around the country, and they've allowed me to even bring my kids or a kid with me, and that makes it an extra special
Fun.
time. And you want to point out some of those extra blessings that your kids get and make a big deal about
Yeah.
it, and allow them to see God's blessing in the midst of even the challenges that exist in the local church.
We're naturally not a thankful people. That's why God had his people set up
Ebenezer's.
yes.
Yes.
To be reminded of God's provision. Our kids need those we need those reminders, but our kids need those reminders too. You cannot over vocalize positivity and being thankful.
Yeah. The second practical tip is expose your kids to great people because of ministry. Your mentors or your friends, your coach. Have ministry get-togethers in your home where you have church leaders or other church leaders and missionaries that come and just have fun and see that this can be fun. I think too of one of the things that it meant a lot to us in ministry, but also to our kids, is when I've had a speaking engagement or I've gone somewhere to teach for another church. Oftentimes they want to honor me with some type of honorarium, and I've just simply asked, hey, that's fine, but would you partition some of that and just send a gift card to my kids, and with a note just saying thank you for allowing your dad to come and share with us. Hey, here's some money to go to Dairy Queen or something like that. Take your dad and your mom out and just say thank you to them. And my kids get excited when they get, number one, they get something in the mail, but they get something that they feel like they can contribute. And that just in that process creates an incredible positive perspective of ministry that I promise you will stay with them for a lifetime.
Absolutely.
Number 3, flex your schedule to be present at key kids' activities. Ministry will give you a unique freedom when it comes to flexibility of schedule. I think about both of our families. I mean, our dads were incredible at making sure that they were getting to every sporting event that they could possibly get to. If they needed to say no to some type of ministry thing, most of the time they did, if they could get out of that just to be there. And that, even now as an adult raising our own kids, that was impactful, and it's still impactful. And so recognize the fact that you do have a different level of flexibility. Yes, you're going to work and you're going to work hard, but you do have some of the privilege of being able to flex your schedule accordingly. And it's okay. You don't need to feel guilty about maybe checking out at a half hour or an hour early one day in order to get to a kid's sporting event or arts event or something of that sort. Number 4, don't make your kids be who others want them to be. Encourage your kids to be themselves. Teach them to learn to be the person that God wants them to be. Anything you want to say in addition to that, Melissa?
And we see this in our 3 kids. They're all so different. And just like in your own home, you see kind of what your kids' strengths and weaknesses are, and they're different than yours. Celebrate that, allow God to use those things that they're good at. And with for instance, our oldest, he's pretty good at reading people. He's pretty good at knowing kind of what's going on. He's fairly intuitive, and allowing him to use that to kind of be aware. It's made him able to read certain situations, and we can kind of even allow his input on what he perceives or what he sees in people, and kind of helping him know how to use that.
Love it. And then last practical tips. Number one, be content just where you are. Your kids will pick up on that, and so allow your joy to be present because of who Jesus is in your life and in the moment. Don't walk through constantly pessimistic. Just trust that Lord is using you in that space, even in the midst of those most challenging moments, knowing that He will use those things to help you persevere and to refine you in the person that He wants you to be. And our kids will trigger off of whether or not we're content or not. Number two, leave church conflict at the church. Be very, very
Hard to do sometimes.
hard to do, yes, but be very intentional about when you're home being present. And Melissa challenged me years ago, which was a very, very helpful challenge that I didn't even realize I was doing it. But when my kids were super young, I'd come home from a long day at work and I'm still on the phone dealing with church stuff. Sometimes it was good, sometimes it was challenges and crisis. And I'd walk through the garage and my kids were there ready and excited to greet me, and I was still on the phone, and it was detrimental in their perspective because I had a tendency to just kind of blow them off until I got off the phone. And so that in itself even forced me to begin to adapt different systems and structures into my life to make sure that that wasn't the case. And so we just made an agreement. Like if I'm on a phone call, I will just stay in my vehicle until I'm off down the road or even in the driveway if necessary. And then I get off the phone, I'll walk in and be completely present and actually turn my phone on do not disturb or even stick it in a drawer so that way I can be present and not so focused on what was taking place during the day at the church. Number three, be involved in the church. What does that mean for you, Melissa, and even for our kids at this stage of the game?
I think it's definitely, I grew up when my dad first planted the church, we met in a restaurant. And after church, the church had to be turned back into the restaurant. And I have vivid memories of filling up salt and pepper shakers and Parmesan cheese shakers to turn it back into a restaurant. And I mean, I was, 11 years old doing that. And of course, sometimes there were things that I didn't want to do, or even now with my own kids, there's certain things you don't want to do. But teaching them service and some of those things that are really valuable can actually be a great impact. My daughter has enjoyed, fortunately, our children's ministry is allowed kid volunteers when paired with adults, and my daughter loves to help me in the nursery. She's good with the kids and she enjoys it. I think that's already instilling in her the joy that can come from serving and being involved in the church.
Great. Number four, talk about the benefits of ministry. We've already talked a little bit about that. Number five, I want to encourage you. I know this is difficult, but you do need to take regular vacations. Take times where you get away. And Pastor, talking specifically to you, if you are the main communicator, it's oftentimes difficult to just get away. Partly because of the own pressure that we put on ourselves. What I've learned, and some of this I learned through the hardship, when you spend 12 weeks bedridden because of a surgery, I realized in my church, even though I was the lead pastor, I wasn't nearly as important as I thought I was. And so hear me talking about this from a personal standpoint. You're not as important as you think you are. It's okay to take time and get away, and you need to be recharged. And I would encourage you, if you are the main communicator, at least once a year, you need to get away on vacation where you have 2 weekends off of preaching in a row. So that way, mentally and emotionally, you can actually come down. You're not, while you're on vacation, having to prep and prepare another sermon because you won't honestly go on break. You won't find the rest that you need to in that season. And so I would encourage you to take at least once a year where you have 2 Sundays off in a row.
And there have been times where you're off on a Sunday and you decide, I'm still going to go, but there have been times you could go and you say, no, I'm off. I'm going to stay home.
I'm going to stay home and I'm going to rest.
That's okay.
It is okay. Next, allow your kids to experience the power of prayer. I think it's an incredibly eye-opening, faith-building exercise that when you engage them to pray about things that maybe you as a family are wrestling through, or there's change that's imminent, or there's a challenge that somebody else even in the church is facing, whether or not it's like, hey, this couple in our church really wants to have a baby and they can't. let's pray for them. And when they see God begin to answer prayers, even from a young age, it has an incredible momentum to effectively build their faith, not just for a season, but for long term, for life. Then lastly, be vulnerable about your own struggles in front of your children without giving them a distaste for the church. I shared a little bit about how my own family has done that. We've tried to do that. I wouldn't say we've been perfect in that process, but again, I think opening that door and having a level of authenticity and transparency helps us push away the hypocrisy that sometimes can creep in our homes, and specifically as ministry homes.
I have had, and I'm sure you have too, you're in the car, you're getting a kid out of bed on a Sunday morning, and I don't want to go to church. I think, allow them to verbalize that. Don't say that, or shun them for that. I mean, I'm usually like, you know what? I kind of wanted to stay in bed this morning too. I don't want to go to church. I'm tired, or I don't feel like doing this. Sometimes, though, we have to do things we just don't feel like doing, and that's all of life. Sometimes it means you need to lean in and say, hey, what is going on? Why are you, if this is a pattern of them not wanting to go to church, what's going on? What is happening that's making you not want to go there? And allow your kids to express that. If they feel like they can't express that to you, then that's going to be a bigger problem. They need to be able to communicate to you in a safe way about what's going on for them. Or if you shut down that door of communication, that's not going to be healthy. They need to feel like they can express those things. Now, you can guide them through their feelings. We obviously don't live by those feelings, or we don't allow those feelings to dictate us, but we can acknowledge them and we can talk about them.
Awesome. Well, so as we kind of conclude our time and talking through just parenting in the bubble, I want you to take a moment and just share a little bit of your heart and what God is doing in your heart when it comes to a ministry and calling that you feel like He's moving you towards, and how that may be prevalent to any of our pastor wives that may be watching.
Well, I'm on the journey. My kids, like I said, are 15, 11, and 6. We're still figuring out things and taking it sometimes a week at a time. But I definitely have a heart for wives and moms of kids in ministry and wives of pastors, and wanting their church experience to be something that they can look on with joy, even in hardship, even in difficulty. And that's ultimately, that's why we're here. We really want to see families succeed and have a great experience being in a pastor's family. And that's something that you may be walking in that and wanting to have more insight or more encouragement or more conversation about that. That's why we're here.
We're here, and we want to be a resource to you. And Melissa specifically is going to be creating cohort opportunities and do some one-on-one even coaching for pastor wives that might be interested in that. We're going to eventually even add some courses specifically geared for spouses walking through and navigating the challenges of ministry. So please stay tuned to that. Melissa will be regularly joining me in kind of the live Q&A that we'll do every other week. And when there's questions that are relevant to pastors' wives or even parenting, I'll be bringing her and asking her to come and engage those conversations with me as well. But we want to remind you, we're here for you. And we know that it's challenging and there's a lot of pressure that sometimes we can feel, not just in the ministry, but also as we raise kids in the bubble of ministry. And if there's ever something that we can do, even if it's a one-off, or if you love couples coaching, we're here to be able to do that from a one-on-one perspective as well. But thanks for taking the time to tune in, and look forward to continuing to keep the conversations moving.